Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yes!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
He's a great guy.
Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHAL.
One of the things that appeals to me immediately in Jack Buckby's new book, A Monster of Their Own Making, a sentence right near the beginning, and I quote part of it: "I have no political affiliation, and any defense of a political party or group in this text is done for the express purpose of identifying hypocrisy and offering a more accurate analysis." I left out the beginning and the very last part of the sentence, but that's where my brain always is too. And I think that kind of analysis is most helpful, but especially when it comes from somebody who has insights into important things going on politically and culturally in our nation and in other nations, things that most people think they know about but don't. Joining us to talk about his experience with what some people call the far right, Jack Buckby, counter-extremist, author, research associate at the Frontier Center, calling us from England today. Good morning, Jack. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Ross. Thanks so much for having me on.
Very glad to. Tell us a little bit about your journey, let's say, that led to the writing of this book.
So I am now 27 years old, and when I was 15 or 16, I was effectively radicalized. I was attracted to a white nationalist political party in the United Kingdom called the British National Party, which at the time was doing exceptionally well. It won 1 million votes, which is big in a country of our size. It won elected representatives in the European Union, and it had elected councillors all over the country. It was astonishing that this white nationalist, a party with roots in neo-Nazism, was doing extremely well over the UK. And I joined because I was, and I am, a white working class man who was being affected by mass immigration, who was seeing changes to our economy, who was seeing job losses and changes to our community. And the only people that were talking about it were neo-Nazis. And what happened is this party changed their face. They became more respectable. They sort of tried to portray themselves as, we're not really the extremist guys. But the fact was, they were the only people talking about difficult political issues. And I was radicalized. And that set off a long journey through the far right, having seen friends of mine become far right terrorists. And I think over the years, it's given me an insight into this issue that most people don't really understand, because for most people who say that they are a former far right activist, they're usually left-wing. They're usually multiculturalists. They're usually Democrats or socialists. Mm-hmm. But I'm a conservative, and I'm not afraid to say I'm a conservative because I've come out the other end. I've seen the right and I've seen the wrong.
Yeah. And I'm curious, just to be very precise on terminology, in terms of your own current political views, are you more truly conservative or are you more libertarian, freedom-oriented?
So I'm an English conservative, so there's going to be a difference. You guys might think I'm a lefty, honestly, in America. But the idea of left and right changes a little depending what country you're in. Right. I consider myself largely a conservative, but maybe some Americans would consider me a conservative Democrat. I don't know.
Gotcha. Okay, so now one of the pieces of terminology that I struggle with is far right. This term far right. As a guy who's been through all this, what does far right mean to you?
So I had to write an entire chapter in this book because I knew that half of my audience was going to be American, and perhaps I'm sure we'll talk about this later, why this book's important for America. But I had to write an entire chapter explaining what I mean by far right, because as I say, there's differences depending if you're in the UK or the US. But here's what I really tried to do. I don't want to engage in a battle where I completely try and redefine what people understand the far right to be, because it's a losing battle. I'm a pragmatist. It's a losing battle. So I went from the basis of ignoring economic stances and looking entirely at social political stances. So with regards to the book and understanding what it means with the context of the book, when I say far right, I mean people who are not just conservative, but extremely conservative, and not just nationalist, but extremely nationalist. So we're not talking about restricting immigration, which is an entirely rational and sensible thing. We're talking about deporting people based on skin color and things like that. That's what I consider far right in the context of this book.
My special guest, Jack Buckby, his new book is called Monster of Their Own Making. Now, when you say, Jack, that you were radicalized, what exactly does that mean?
So I was a non-political 15, 16-year-old, and I happened to be during a sort of divisive election campaign for the European elections in 2009, and it was seeing an insurgency of the far right. And I saw it on the television, and it got me thinking. And around this same time, I discovered something that you may have heard of, and perhaps your listeners have heard of, is Muslim grooming gangs, which is a phenomenon that happened in the UK, which has since been outed by government reports of majority Muslim gangs of men who were raping and abusing young white girls and young Indian and Sikh girls, basically any young girls who weren't Muslim, abusing and raping them and shipping them around the country, trafficking these young girls. It went unreported for decades. The police are understood to have torn up reports about it, and local politicians, left-wing politicians, refused to talk about it because they were scared of being called racist. Right. And at that time, nobody was talking about this politically. The only people that talked about it were neo-Nazis and the far right. And as an angry young white man, rightfully, enraged by that, seeing people in my working class community being abused, I got involved with the people that talked about it.
Yeah. I might be one of the few American radio hosts you'll talk to who knows the word Rotherham.
Yeah.
I know this story, and it's a disgusting story. And the way that the left-wing politicians there refused to talk about it is beyond shameful.
It is. To anyone listening, I would encourage them to look up the J Report, which was the government-commissioned report that looked into what happened in Rotherham, which is a town in Yorkshire in England, and it saw 1,400 young girls abused over a period of years, and the local politicians admitted they were too scared to address it because the perpetrators, the rapists, were Muslim.
So you started listening to these folks who were talking about these problems. They cause you to start thinking either in a certain way or about certain issues. But separately from what they caused you to think or think about, what, if anything, did they cause you to do?
So I never became the real kind of far-right monster that we saw produced by these people. I was in a circle of young, white, working-class people, largely from the Lancashire area, which is an area in the northwest of England. I was in this circle of young people who we were drawn in by this. There's a big point I make in my book about proving the far right right. The far right was consistently proved right by the inaction of the politicians. So they were the only people talking about grooming gangs. So we thought, well, if they're right about this, maybe they're right about other things. And you know what? It turned out they were right. Immigration was causing an economic stress in our country, and it was changing communities. And no moderate, conservative or liberal politician wanted to talk about it. So they proved the far right right, in a sense. So me and many other young lads trusted the people that we were taken in by and slowly radicalized by. We trusted them to be right about other things too. I'm very, very pleased, and I still to this day wonder how or why I didn't go down the same route as some of my friends, but I found my way out of it, and it was difficult, and I'm still slandered all these years later. I found my way out of it, and I try and help other young people in any way I can who are going down that route to realize that, yes, there are injustices, but no, you cannot side with these extremists. But people I knew became terrorists. Young men from my hometown attempted to murder our local member of parliament. One fella I knew from Liverpool, I think he's still in prison for throwing a Molotov cocktail through someone's window. Young men were radicalized by righteous anger, and extremists took advantage of them.
Is that female MP who was attacked a few years back? Is that a different story?
No, but No, that's a different story. That was a lady called Jo Cox. She was murdered by a far-right terrorist.
Wow. Interesting to hear you just so openly use the word terrorist. A lot of people are very, they tiptoe a lot with their words, and you clearly don't.
No, absolutely not. Here's the thing. I think it's important, it's so easy for us as conservatives or people, quote unquote, on the right to deny the existence of the quote unquote far right because it's probably politically expedient. Here's one thing I make some criticism of. Whenever we've seen a terrorist attack in the United States where somebody has gone into a synagogue or a church and shot people dead, and they do it based on Jew hatred or racism and things like that, I think it's way too easy for conservatives to say, but he believed in socialized healthcare, therefore he's a leftist liberal. Like, give it a second. No, that's not quite right, because he wasn't shooting up the synagogue because he believed in universal health care. These are social political issues, and I think we should be willing to say, yes, he was far right, but that doesn't mean he's representative of conservatives. That doesn't mean he's representative of us. We have to be willing to say, yes, there is extremism here. Yes, actually, it's a smaller threat than Islamist terrorism, but it exists. And the reason why it exists, as I explore in the book, is a three-pronged attack caused by the far left, the media, and the politicians. And that's what we need to talk about, rather than shying away from it. Like, own the issue.
You raise a really interesting point, and, well, a lot of really interesting points, but a lot of folks in the media in particular want to take any far-right person and use them as an exemplar of all people who are right of center, and yet you don't see anyone in the media right now talking about the far left radicals destroying things in the United States and in the UK and saying those people are an exemplar of liberals.
Well, do you know what? You know why that is? That is because the extremism narrative has been controlled by the left and the far left for too long. Because conservatives, I don't think this has been a conscious decision. I think it's just a snowball effect. But conservatives, in my opinion, have been too afraid to take on this issue because they've warped the idea that nobody is far right because the far left says everyone is far right these days. The idea that means that there is no far right is silly. So I think we as conservatives should be owning this extremism issue. Why is it that every counter-extremism outfit that you can think of or that I can think of is left-wing? Why is that? Why are the only people talking about extremism in a general sense left-wing and often far left too? I think that's crazy. If we as conservatives or people right of center, or you know what, even people who just aren't far left, if we can retake that extremism narrative, it becomes so much easier for us to openly talk about the extremism of the far left and of the far right. But I think it's also important that we talk about how the far left radicalism we're seeing on the streets, the burning down of churches and black-owned businesses, we need to talk about the effect that that's having in radicalizing the far right too.
Yes, and let's get to that in 1 second. My special guest, Jack Buckby, joining us from England. His new book is called Monster of Their Own Making. I'd like to... first of all, I have a quick sort of partial answer to the question you just raised. Why is it only the left that's talking about extremism? And one answer, at least in the United States, I don't know if this is the same in England, is that the leftists set up these groups so that they can call everybody that they disagree with extremist, and they pretend to be anti-extremist, but really much of their motivation is to shut up anybody who doesn't agree with them.
Yep. Oh, yeah, that's entirely accurate. That's exactly what happens in the UK, too. And that's precisely why I want to start owning this issue, too. I don't want to just step away from it and constantly defend myself. I am someone who has seen radicalization of me, of my friends. I know how it works. I outline those steps in the book in great detail. I want to be one of those people actually tackling extremism rather than using it as a political tool.
All right, so I want to kind of combine two questions together. So one, and you mentioned this earlier, why is your book, the story of a young working class white guy in England. Why is that important for America? So that's half of what I want to ask you. And the other half I want to ask you, really at the same time, is what is helping the far right now? What is boosting membership and interest in the far right? And so let's see if you can put these things together, because it might help Americans of goodwill understand what to do to not help the far right.
Absolutely. So here's why it's important. The process is the same. I outline in the book something called the three-pronged attack. And let me explain how that works. It starts by the politicians neglecting you. It starts by the politicians saying, oh, well, you can't talk about that issue because that's racist. You can't talk about immigration because, that's bigoted. And so working class communities, or I think middle class, as you say, in the United States, are left behind. That's why you saw Donald Trump win in 2016. And then when the politicians ignore you, it's easy to look at the media and think, well, the media, the press, they're the guys to represent the issues that the politicians refuse to talk about, right? They're meant to be the check on the politicians. But then you open up the New York Times or something and holy crap, they're worse than the politicians. They're the most extreme people you can think of, trying to portray the radical ideas as normal. And so they're not representative of normal working people. In the UK, working class white people. In America, middle America. Mm-hmm. And so finally, the only thing you're left with is taking to the streets and protesting. And when you take to the streets and protest, as we did when I was a teenager, when you take to the streets, you might get a bike lock to the head. You might get a brick to your head. You might see an old woman get punched by Antifa, which I did in 2011. It's a three-pronged attack that backs people into a corner. And what that does is it tells working class, normal people, normal Americans, normal Brits, you can't have an opinion. You cannot. You are wrong. You need to be quiet. But if you're not quiet, we will beat you until you are. And that pushes people into a corner. And what you find is a lot of people actually stay silent. A lot of people accept, well, this is the way the world is now. But a lot of other people say, no, I'm going to stand up to this. And when they do say they're going to stand up to this, oftentimes, the most vocal people against it are genuinely extreme. And what we're seeing in the UK is far-right groups, and by far-right, I'm talking in the context of the book, neo-Nazi groups, are using footage of Black Lives Matter and Antifa to recruit. And that's terrifying. And they're using it to recruit. What better ammunition do these people need than footage of black people and white liberals burning down churches? This is a terrifying thing to happen. And if America isn't careful, if they continue down this route, if God forbid Joe Biden wins in November, this is going to get worse, and it's going to push people into a corner to the point where they have nothing to lose.
Wow. I wish I disagreed with any of that, but I don't. It's all absolutely right. And it's very scary. I'm just about out of time here, Jack, but I'm very curious what the discussion is like in the UK right now about protecting statues.
The discussion is, the politicians really haven't talked that much about it, if I'm honest with you. It's been happening in London. There's been a few instances of some statues being, attempted to be removed, but it's not quite as bad in the UK. London's bad, but the general discussion is that it's insane. They really didn't help themselves when they tried to tear down a statue of Winston Churchill, the man who defeated the Nazis. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Folks, I want you to go get Jack Buckby's new book, Monster of Their Own Making. You can follow Jack on Twitter at Jack Buckby, Jack Buckby. You left us with a lot to think about, Jack, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more after reading your book. Thanks for being here, and thanks for having the courage to come out and do what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Wow. Can you imagine? Just barely. He's a very good storyteller, isn't he? Very good storyteller. Let's think about that for a minute. We'll be right back on The Ross Kaminsky Show.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Michael Brown at 2, 630 KHOW, Denver.